When night falls across the highways and quiet suburbs of America, most people lock their doors and assume they are safe. But history has shown us that evil doesn't always lurk in the shadows. It often lives next door, hiding behind ordinary smiles, respectable jobs, and reassuring handshakes. The most terrifying monsters are not ghosts or demons from folklore. They are human beings, breathing the same air as us, walking the same streets, and yet carrying within them an abyss of cruelty. Across decades, certain names have etched themselves into America's collective nightmare. The deceptively charming Ted Bundy, who could lure victims with nothing more than a smile and a fake cast. The grotesquely theatrical John Wayne Gacy, who dressed as a clown for neighborhood children while burying bodies under his home. Jeffrey Dahmer, the quiet man in an ordinary apartment whose refrigerator hid human heads. And Aileen Wuornos, one of the rare female serial killers, who claimed she was a victim even as her hands pulled the trigger again and again. Their crimes were not just killings, they were acts of domination, rituals of power, twisted expressions of pain and desire. And behind every story lies the same haunting question: are killers born evil, or are they forged by the relentless cruelty of the world around them? On the sun-bleached highways of Florida, in the late 1982, truckers whispered a chilling warning. There was a lone figure thumbing rides who carried far more than just a troubled past. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and she would become one of the most infamous figures in American crime history. Aileen's life began under a cloud of tragedy. Born in 1956, she never had a chance at a normal childhood. Her father was imprisoned for violent offenses and later took his own life behind bars. Her mother abandoned her before she reached the age of 5, leaving Aileen and her brother to survive in a hostile world. By 11, she was already trading small favors for food and cigarettes. At 14, she became pregnant after being abused by someone close to the family. The child was put up for adoption, and soon after, Aileen was cast out of her home entirely. From then on, she lived on the fringes of society, sleeping in abandoned cars, scavenging in the woods of Michigan, and teaching herself to survive by whatever means necessary. That broken childhood forged someone who trusted no one and used her body and charm as both weapon and shield. By her 20s, she had drifted to Florida, supporting herself through roadside encounters. Few men who stopped their cars imagined they were about to meet someone who would later be called the Highway Huntress. Between 1989 and 1990, 7 men were murdered along Florida's roadsides. The pattern was grim and unmistakable. Each victim had been shot at close range, their cars stolen, their belongings stripped, and their bodies left to decay under the blistering Sunday. Wuornos never denied pulling the trigger. But her explanation was as complex as it was chilling. She claimed that every man had tried to assault her and that she acted in self-defense. To her, she was not a predator, she was striking back at a lifetime of cruelty. But investigators saw it differently. They pointed to the repetition, the thefts, the cold efficiency. This was not chance. This was calculation. What made Aileen unforgettable wasn't only the violence, it was the storm she brought into the courtroom. While most defendants are coached to appear calm, remorseful, even broken, Aileen erupted in fury. She shouted at judges, cursed at juries, and raged at cameras with venom that filled the headlines. In one infamous moment, she shouted, "I killed those men in cold blood." The courtroom gasped. Viewers at home saw someone unhinged, someone who seemed to wear her violence almost as a badge. But hidden behind the anger was also a thread of tragedy. Aileen's one true connection had been with a woman named Tyria Moore, whom she met in a Daytona bar years earlier. Their relationship became her anchor. Yet after Aileen's arrest, Moore was persuaded by investigators to help gather evidence. In a series of recorded phone calls, Moore asked Aileen to clear her name. Desperate to protect the only person she had ever loved, Aileen confessed on tape, sealing her own fate. In 1992, Aileen was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Over the next decade, her mind unraveled further on death row. She accused guards of poisoning her food, ranted about conspiracies, and spoke of sonic weapons attacking her. Her last words before execution in 2002 were bizarre, almost cinematic. "I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus, on a spaceship." Moments later, the lethal injection ended her life. Her story did not end there. Hollywood turned her into legend with documentaries, books, and the Oscar-winning film Monster. To this day, people argue, was she truly a monster who hunted men along Florida's highways? Or was she a shattered soul who finally struck back after years of being broken by others? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Aileen Wuornos was not born with violence in her veins. She was forged in tragedy, abandonment, and betrayal. But once she picked up a gun and crossed that line, the world would forever remember her not as a victim, but as the predator who turned Florida's roads into killing grounds. When America thinks of serial predators, one name rises above the rest: Ted Bundy. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleyways. He was handsome, articulate, and unnervingly charismatic. Bundy moved easily among politicians, professors, and even crisis hotline workers, where he once answered calls from desperate people in need. On the surface, he was a promising young man with a bright future. But beneath the polished smile hid a hunter whose cruelty would haunt an entire generation. Bundy's killing spree stretched across the 1,970 seconds, cutting through at least 7 states. Officially, he confessed to 30 murders, but investigators believe the true number could have been far higher, perhaps closer to 100. His victims were almost always young women, many of them college students. He chose them not by accident, but with chilling calculation. His method was deceptively simple. Bundy would feign weakness wearing a fake cast on his arm, or walking with crutches. Then, with a warm smile and soft-spoken charm, he asked for help carrying books, loading items into his car, or walking him to safety. The moment trust was given, he struck. A sudden blow with a crowbar, a swift abduction, and then, in the privacy of some secluded location, the nightmare unfolded. But Bundy's violence went beyond murder. He sought control, domination, and ritual. Investigators later revealed he often returned to crime scenes days later to revisit the bodies, committing unspeakable acts with the remains. In some cases, he took trophies, skulls, kept as reminders of his power. This was not just killing. It was obsession, a grotesque ritual that placed him among the most infamous predators in history. In January 1974, his cruelty escalated. He broke into the basement apartment of a University of Washington student, bludgeoned her with a crowbar, and assaulted her with such savagery that she was left with permanent brain damage. Weeks later, another student vanished, her body dumped in a remote area. By the summer, Bundy's boldness was staggering. He abducted 2 women, in broad daylight, from a crowded park within hours of each other. Witnesses recalled a man with his arm in a sling, introducing himself simply as Ted. It was the first time his real name became tied to his crimes. Despite growing suspicion, Bundy's ability to blend in was terrifying. Friends described him as polite and intelligent. Professors saw him as dedicated. Women found him charming. He dated, smiled for photographs, and even studied law, as though living a double life with chilling precision. In 1975, his carefully constructed mask began to crack. Arrested for a failed kidnapping, police searched his Volkswagen Beetle. Inside, they found handcuffs, ski masks, ropes, and crowbars, the tools of a predator. But even in custody, Bundy refused to be contained. Twice, he escaped. Once, by leaping from a courthouse window and vanishing for nearly a week. Later, by squeezing through a hole in the ceiling of his cell and walking out of prison like a ghost. His final rampage came in January 1978 in Florida. In the dead of night, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Armed with nothing but rage, he bludgeoned and strangled 4 women, killing 2 and leaving 2 others critically injured. Weeks later, he abducted and murdered 1 2-year-old Kimberly Leach, a crime so heinous it sealed his fate. Bundy's trials were unlike anything America had ever seen. The courtroom became a stage, cameras swarming, reporters filling every seat. Women, astonishingly, flocked to watch him, some writing him letters of admiration, enchanted by his dark charisma. Bundy, ever the manipulator, acted as his own attorney, questioning witnesses, flashing smiles at the press, and even proposing marriage to a woman in the middle of court. But charm could not erase the evidence. Witnesses, forensic proof, and his own arrogance closed the trap. In 1979, Bundy was sentenced to death for the Chi Omega murders. Later, he received a second death sentence for Kimberly Leach's murder. For nearly a decade, he toyed with investigators, offering fragments of confessions, hinting at more victims than he would ever admit. Just before his execution, he attempted one last manipulation, blaming his crimes on an addiction to violent media, hoping to twist the narrative even in his final days. On the 24th of January 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds cheered, chanting, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Vendors sold hot dogs and T-shirts, turning the execution into a grotesque carnival. It was, many felt, a fitting end to a man who had inflicted so much pain. Bundy once said, "We serial killers are your sons, your husbands. We are everywhere." His words were meant as a warning, a taunt, and a truth. The face of evil is not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it's the man who smiles at you in the daylight. In the summer of 1991, police officers in Milwaukee stepped into what looked like an ordinary apartment. But as they crossed the threshold, they were struck by a smell that would haunt them forever, a stench of death so overwhelming it made even hardened detectives stagger. Inside that small, nondescript home, they discovered a nightmare that would shock the entire world. This was the lair of Jeffrey Dahmer, a man whose crimes would redefine the very meaning of horror. Over a span of 13 years, Dahmer claimed the lives of 17 young men. But it wasn't just the killings. What made him one of the most infamous criminals in modern history was the disturbing nature of his acts. He drugged, strangled, and dismembered his victims. He photographed their bodies in grotesque poses. He preserved skulls and bones as trophies. In his refrigerator, detectives found severed heads. In a 57-gallon drum, they uncovered dissolving torsos. This was not merely murder, it was obsession taken to its darkest extreme. To understand how such a nightmare unfolded, we must look back at Dahmer's beginnings. Born in 1,960 inches, Bath, Ohio, Jeffrey was described as a shy, withdrawn boy. From a young age, he developed a fascination with death. He collected roadkill, dissected animals in a backyard shed, and quietly nurtured fantasies of control and dominance. Teachers noticed his strange behavior, but few could have predicted the darkness that was growing inside him. As a teenager, isolation consumed him. While others planned for college or careers, Dahmer sank into alcoholism and violent thoughts. His first murder came shockingly early, just after high school graduation in 1978. He picked up one 8-year-old hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, brought him home for drinks, and when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer bludgeoned him with a dumbbell before strangling him. He crushed the bones and scattered them in the woods. Hicks disappeared, and no one suspected the quiet boy next door. For nearly a decade, Dahmer hid his urges. He briefly joined the army, only to be discharged for alcohol abuse. He lived with his grandmother, who grew suspicious of his late nights and strange behavior. But when questioned, he always had excuses. The facade couldn't hold forever. By 1987, his darkness resurfaced. At a Milwaukee hotel, Dahmer lured Stephen Tuomi, murdered him, and kept the body for days, experimenting with dismemberment. From that moment, his descent accelerated. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer stalked bars and nightclubs, targeting vulnerable men with offers of money, photographs, or companionship. Once inside his apartment, his pattern repeated: sedatives, strangulation, and then the twisted rituals of what he called companionship. Perhaps the most disturbing detail was Dahmer's attempt to create living zombies. He drilled holes into his victims' skulls and poured acid or boiling water inside, hoping to keep them alive yet completely under his control. Every attempt failed, ending in death. These acts revealed not just cruelty, but a terrifying desire to dominate life itself. His crimes could have been stopped earlier. In May 1991, a 4-year-old boy escaped Dahmer's apartment, bleeding and incoherent. Neighbors called police. Officers arrived, only to be calmly persuaded by Dahmer that the boy was his partner and that they had simply argued. The police escorted the child back into Dahmer's apartment. Hours later, he was dead. This failure would forever stand as one of the most tragic mistakes in law enforcement history. The end came just 2 months later. On the 22nd of July 1991, another man, Tracy Edwards, managed to flee the apartment with one wrist still in handcuffs. He flagged down police, who followed him back to Dahmer's home. What they found would leave them scarred for life. The photographs of mutilated bodies, the fridge with a human head, the freezer with human remains. It was a house of horrors hidden in plain sight. Dahmer confessed calmly, almost casually. He admitted to the murders, describing in chilling detail his rituals of dismemberment and even cannibalism. He spoke of eating parts of his victims to become part of them. He described fantasies of building a private altar from bones and skulls, complete with candles and altar to his own dark obsession. In 1992, Dahmer's trial became a media spectacle. Families of the victims sat in horror as his crimes were revealed in detail. The defense argued insanity. The jury disagreed. They found him legally sane and guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, nearly 1,000 years in prison. But prison would not be his escape. On the 28th of November, 1994, just 2 years after his sentencing, Jeffrey Dahmer was attacked and beaten to death by another inmate, Christopher Scarver. It was a brutal end for a man who had inflicted unimaginable cruelty. Even in death, his name casts a long shadow. The phrase, "the Milwaukee Monster," still sends chills down spines. His crimes remind us that evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it lives quietly in an apartment down the hall, while the rest of the world goes on, unaware that a nightmare is unfolding behind a locked door. Few names in American crime history strike such a grotesque chord as John Wayne Gacy. To neighbors in suburban Chicago, he was the friendly contractor who hired local kids for work, the man who organized block parties, and the cheerful volunteer who dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain children at hospitals and charity events. But beneath the painted smile and the mask of community respectability, Gacy hid one of the most horrifying secrets of all: the bodies of at least 33 young men, most of them buried beneath the very floorboards of his own home. Born in 1942, Gacy's early life gave glimpses of the turmoil to come. His father, a violent alcoholic, mocked him as weak and worthless. His health was fragile. Fainting spells and illnesses made him feel like an outcast. Yet even in those years, he craved approval, a hunger for validation that would twist, later, into a deadly need for control. By his 20s, he appeared to be settling into ordinary life. He married, had children, and opened a small contracting business. To the outside world, John Wayne Gacy looked like a man building the American dream, but appearances lied. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenager in Iowa. He served less than 2 years in prison before being released. That conviction should have ended his double life forever, yet Gacy returned to Chicago, where he rebuilt his image and once again earned the trust of his community. By the 1,970 seconds, he was rubbing elbows with local politicians, hosting neighborhood barbecues, and donning the costume of Pogo the Clown to delight children. He became the picture of civic pride. Behind closed doors, however, he was luring young men off in runaways, troubled youths, or boys seeking work into his home. His trick was simple, yet sinister. He called it a magic handcuff game. He would persuade his guests to put on the cuffs, laughing as if it were a harmless joke. Once locked, the smile vanished. What followed was hours of assault, torment, and for most, death. Strangled with a rope or suffocated, their bodies were hidden away as though discarded like trash. The scale of his crimes was staggering. Neighbors occasionally complained about the foul odor seeping from Gacy's property. Some assumed it was sewer problems. Others blamed a nearby construction site. In truth, the smell was death itself, dozens of victims buried in the crawl space beneath his home. Still, Gacy deflected suspicion with charm and excuses, living as a respected community figure while his house slowly became a tomb. The unraveling of Gacy's carefully maintained facade began in December 1978, when one 5-year-old Robert P.S. vanished after telling his mother he was going to speak with Gacy about a construction job. When police began to investigate, the cracks finally widened. A search warrant revealed incriminating evidence: personal belongings of missing boys, suspicious items, and, eventually, the horrifying truth beneath the floorboards. Over days of digging, investigators unearthed body after body from the crawl space. In total, 29 victims were discovered beneath the house. 4 others were found in nearby rivers. Even seasoned detectives were shaken, describing the stench and the sight as unforgettable. Gacy's suburban home, once a gathering place for neighborhood parties, had become a mass grave. His arrest sent shockwaves through America. How could a man so seemingly ordinary, so woven into the fabric of his community, harbor such monstrous secrets? The contrast between Gacy the clown, smiling for photographs, and Gacy the killer, stacking corpses beneath his floor, made his story a media frenzy. Newspapers branded him the Killer Clown, a nickname that still chills to this day. At his 1,980 trial, prosecutors laid out the gruesome evidence. Survivors described his cruelty. Families of the missing wept as police recounted pulling bones from the crawl space. Gacy's defense claimed insanity, suggesting that an alternate personality named Jack had committed the murders. But the jury was unmoved. They found him guilty of 33 murders, the most attributed to one man in U.S. history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For 14 years on death row, Gacy painted portraits of clowns, many of which later sold for thousands of dollars to morbid collectors. He gave interviews alternating between denial, blame-shifting, and arrogant justifications. In one infamous statement, he sneered, "I should never have been convicted of anything more serious than running a cemetery without a license." On the 10th of May, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some holding signs, others cheering, as though celebrating the end of a nightmare. His brain was studied in hopes of finding a biological explanation for his depravity, but no definitive answers came. Today, the lot where his house once stood is empty. The crawl space is gone, the earth filled in, but the memory remains. Every time someone speaks of hidden evil lurking behind a friendly smile, Gacy's shadow returns a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters wear masks of laughter and paint their faces with bright colors to hide the truth. In the mid-1,980 seconds, fear gripped California like a tightening fist. Doors were bolted shut, windows nailed closed, and families slept with lights on. Whispers spread from Los Angeles to San Francisco of a predator who came in the dead of night, striking without warning, leaving behind scenes so savage they seemed almost unreal. He had no pattern, no mercy, and no boundaries. The press would give him a name that chilled the entire nation: the Night Stalker. His real name was Richard Ramirez, and he was unlike any criminal America had ever seen. Unlike many killers who stalked a particular type of victim, Ramirez was terrifyingly unpredictable. He broke into homes at night and unleashed chaos. Sometimes he carried a gun, other times a knife, a cord, even a hammer. He attacked men, women, and children, crossing lines that others had not dared. He robbed, assaulted, and murdered at will, often forcing survivors to swear allegiance to dark powers while he carried out his crimes. His violence was random, ritualistic, and sadistic, an eruption of evil that seemed to descend like a storm over the West Coast. Ramirez's descent into darkness began long before his reign of terror. Born in 1,960 inches El Paso, Texas, he grew up in a world marked by poverty and abuse. His father was quick-tempered and violent, but the most disturbing influence came from his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam veteran. Miguel showed Richard photographs of atrocities from the war, images of mutilation, assault, and death. He boasted about what he had done overseas, warping the impressionable teenager's mind. When Richard was just 13, he stood by helplessly as Miguel shot his wife in the face during an argument. That moment carved itself into his psyche, blending violence with power, trauma with fascination. By his 20s, Ramirez had moved to California. He immersed himself in drugs, theft, and a fascination with the occult. He claimed to find strength in darkness, believing that evil itself guided him. His crimes became an extension of those beliefs. At several scenes, he scrawled pentagrams on walls, forcing his victims to speak the name of Satan as he terrorized them. For him, murder was not just cruelty, it was ritual. Between 1,984 and 1,985, his spree escalated. In June 1984, he murdered 9-year-old Jenny Vincow in her Los Angeles home, stabbing her repeatedly and slashing her throat. It was only the beginning. Over the next year, he struck again and again, leaving bodies and survivors in his wake. He mutilated, he kidnapped, he inflicted suffering that defied comprehension. Unlike many killers who tried to cover their tracks, Ramirez thrived on chaos. He wanted the city to fear him, and it did. The randomness of his attacks paralyzed Southern California. Families huddled together at night, clutching weapons. Gun sales skyrocketed. Neighborhood watches formed, residents patrolling their own streets, with baseball bats and flashlights. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every noise a warning. Newspapers printed terrifying headlines. The words "Night Stalker" became a daily reminder that no one was safe. Yet, like all predators, Ramirez made mistakes. Investigators found footprints at several crime scenes, all matching the same rare shoe, a black Avia sneaker. It was one of the crucial clues that began to link his rampage together. In August 1985, the manhunt reached its climax. Authorities released Ramirez's mugshot to the public. Suddenly, the faceless terror had a face. Just days later, he was recognized in East Los Angeles. As word spread, local residents turned on him. Ramirez tried to flee, but the crowd chased him through the streets, striking him with pipes and holding him down until police arrived. In an extraordinary reversal, The very city he had terrorized captured him with its own hands. His trial in 1989 was as disturbing as his crimes. Ramirez reveled in the attention. He smirked in court, flashed a pentagram carved into his hand, and shouted oaths of allegiance to darkness. While prosecutors detailed his atrocities, some spectators disturbingly were drawn to him. Women sent him love letters. Admirers filled the gallery. Ramirez became a twisted celebrity, embodying the unsettling attraction some feel toward those who commit the unthinkable. But the evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, ballistic matches, eyewitness testimony, and stolen property tied him to the killings. Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 11 sexual assaults, and numerous burglaries. The jury sentenced him to death. His response was chillingly casual. "Big deal," he told reporters. "Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland." For nearly 3 decades, Richard Ramirez lived on death row at San Quentin. In 2013, before his execution date ever arrived, he died of cancer. Yet the shadow he cast still lingers. His unpredictability, his worship of darkness, and his complete disregard for human life marked him as one of the most feared killers in American history. The Night Stalker taught California and the world a brutal lesson. Evil does not always follow patterns. Sometimes it is random, chaotic, and without reason. Sometimes it doesn't hide in the shadows at all. Sometimes it kicks down the door in the middle of the night. In the collapsing Soviet Union of the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, whispers began to spread through villages and small towns. Women vanished. Children disappeared on their way to school. Their bodies, when found, bore wounds so grotesque that even hardened investigators were shaken. For over a decade, an invisible terror stalked the forests and train stations of southern Russia. His name was Andrei Chikatilo, but the world would come to know him by another title: the Butcher of Rostov. Chikatilo's crimes defied imagination. Between 1,978 and 1,990, he murdered at least 52 people, though many believe the number was even higher. His victims were often children, runaways, or vulnerable women. He lured them with promises of food, shelter, or work. Then, once alone, he unleashed violence of unspeakable cruelty. He stabbed, slashed, mutilated, and in some cases, consumed parts of his victims. Investigators described his crime scenes as scenes of butchery rather than murder. To understand how such horror was possible, one must look at the world that shaped him. Chikatilo was born in 1,936 inches Ukraine, during the reign of Stalin and the horrors of famine. His childhood was scarred by hunger, poverty, and humiliation. Neighbors whispered that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten during the famine years. Whether true or not, the rumor hung over his family like a curse. His father was taken prisoner during World War II, leaving young Andrei under the iron grip of a harsh and overbearing mother. He grew up frail, awkward, and burdened by a secret torment: chronic impotence. It filled him with shame, isolation, and self-loathing. As a teacher, he was accused of inappropriate behavior with students, but the Soviet authorities treated such crimes as embarrassments rather than dangers. Again and again, his misdeeds were overlooked, dismissed, or covered up. That negligence allowed him to escalate. His first known murder came in 1978. He lured 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova to a shed, attempted an assault, and when he could not perform, he stabbed her in a frenzy of rage. He dumped her body in a river. The tragedy deepened when another man was wrongly convicted and executed for the crime. Chikatilo was free to kill again, and he did, over and over. Throughout the 1,980 seconds, bodies piled up. Children were found in woods, women near train stations, each victim bearing dozens of stab wounds, often targeted at eyes, chest, and abdomen. Some were mutilated so badly that identification took weeks. The brutality was staggering. Yet the Soviet government, fearful of admitting a serial killer, was on the loose, suppressed information. Authorities charged innocent men to maintain the illusion of order. Meanwhile, Chikatilo hunted in silence, confident that bureaucracy would shield him. By the late 1980 seconds, the pattern was undeniable. Dozens of murders across Rostov Oblast forced the government to form a task force. Investigators named the operation Forest Strip. For years, they chased the phantom killer, but without modern forensics and, under immense political pressure, progress was slow. The breakthrough came in 1990. Undercover officers spotted Chikatilo at a train station, approaching young women and behaving suspiciously. When they detained him, they found incriminating evidence: a knife, rope, and stains on his clothing. A search of his home revealed diaries filled with disturbing notes. At first, he denied everything. But after days of interrogation, he broke. The confessions poured out dozens of murders, described with chilling precision. He explained how stabbing and mutilation gave him the sense of release his body otherwise denied him. He showed no remorse. Investigators listened in horror as he detailed each crime, one by one. His trial in 1992 was a spectacle unlike any Russia had seen. Behind the glass of a reinforced cage, Chikatilo ranted, shouted, even exposed himself in court. Families of the victims screamed in rage, while journalists dubbed him the Red Ripper, comparing him to Jack the Ripper of Victorian London. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitness testimony, confessions, physical proof. The jury convicted him of 52 murders. Judge Leonid Akobzanov delivered the verdict with words that echoed across Russia. "This monster is not a man. He deserves to be executed." The courtroom erupted in applause. On the 14th of February 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. There were no tears, no sympathy, only relief that one of history's worst killers was finally gone. Yet the scars remained. For years, innocent men had been wrongfully accused, even executed, while the real killer roamed free. The case exposed the failures of a system more concerned with appearances than justice, and Chikatilo's name became a permanent reminder of what happens when bureaucracy allows a predator to thrive unchecked. The Butcher of Rostov was not just a killer. He was a symbol of how cruelty, secrecy, and denial can create the perfect conditions for evil to grow. When people think of America's most infamous predators, names like Bundy, Dahmer, or Gacy usually come to mind. But in 2018, the FBI made a chilling announcement. The deadliest serial murderer in U.S. history was not a household name at all. He was a drifter, few remembered. A man who slipped through the cracks of society for decades. His name was Sowell Little. Authorities confirmed he was responsible for at least 93 murders, nearly all women. For over 4 decades, Little moved silently from state to state, leaving behind a staggering trail of bodies. Yet because of who his victims were, marginalized women, often struggling with poverty, addiction, or sex work, many of their deaths were overlooked, written off as accidents or overdoses. His anonymity was his greatest weapon. Sowell Little was born in 1940 Reynolds, Georgia, and raised mostly by his grandmother. His childhood was marked by instability and constant trouble. He drifted through schools, struggled academically, and by his teens was already in and out of juvenile detention. Violence and transience became the rhythm of his life. By the 1960 seconds, his criminal record was long robbery, assault, theft, drug offenses. But those charges only hinted at the darkness within him. His true obsession was control. His method was consistent. He targeted women on society's edges, those less likely to draw immediate attention if they disappeared. He lured them, often with promises of money, alcohol, or a ride. Then, he strangled them using his bare hands, ropes, or belts. Strangulation became his signature because it gave him total dominance and allowed him to watch life drain away slowly. The choice of method also made him nearly invisible. Strangulation often left few obvious marks, especially if coroners lacked advanced forensic tools. Many of his murders were classified as natural deaths, overdoses, or simply unsolved cases. And so, Samuel Little kept killing, confident that no one was looking too closely. He drifted like a ghost across the United States, Florida, Texas, Ohio, California, Louisiana, and beyond. Bodies scattered across the map, but no one connected the dots. Each city thought the tragedy was isolated. In truth, they were all part of one monstrous pattern. The law finally caught him in 2012, not for murder, but for a drug charge. Police in Kentucky arrested him, then extradited him to California on outstanding warrants. There, DNA evidence linked him to 3 murders from the 1,980 seconds. All 3 women had been strangled and dumped like trash. For decades, their families had no answers. Now, the truth was finally coming into focus. At his 2014 trial, Little was convicted of those 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For most killers, that would have been the end of the story. But for Samuel Little, prison became the beginning of a horrifying revelation. In 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland sat down with Little. Patiently, carefully, he drew him into conversation. What emerged was staggering. Little began confessing not just to a few murders, but to dozens. His memory was unnervingly precise. He recalled faces, clothes, the color of cars, the streets where he left bodies. And then, he began to draw. Using nothing but a pencil and his memory, he sketched haunting portraits of his victims, women, forgotten by police files, brought back to life through his twisted recollections. Investigators compared his sketches to cold cases, and match after match emerged. Eventually, the FBI confirmed at least 60 murders, with Little suspected in over 30 more. The sheer scope was almost impossible to grasp. For decades, one man had been killing with near impunity, leaving devastation across 19 states. What made him especially terrifying was his demeanor. In interviews, he chuckled as he described killings, recalling with chilling fondness how victims looked in their final moments. He spoke of them not as human beings, but as trophies. One investigator said, "It was like talking to pure evil, wrapped in the body of an old man." Samuel Little died in December 2020, at the age of 80, serving his life sentence in a California prison. He never faced trial for most of his murders. To this day, the FBI maintains a website with his sketches, hoping to identify more victims and give families long-denied answers. His story forces a painful truth into the light. Many of his victims were ignored not because they were less human, but because society treated them as less important. Poverty, addiction, and stigma made them invisible. And Samuel Little exploited that invisibility to become the most prolific killer in American history. His legacy is not just one of numbers. It is a haunting reminder that behind every statistic was a life, a family, and a future stolen. The most terrifying monsters are not those who make headlines. Sometimes, they are the ones no one notices until it's far too late. In 2009, Cleveland police entered a modest home on Imperial Avenue. From the outside, it was unremarkable, just another aging house in a struggling neighborhood. But when investigators crossed the threshold, the truth struck them like a physical blow. The smell was suffocating. The air was thick with rot and decay. And hidden inside that house, in crawl spaces, shallow graves, and the backyard, were the remains of 11 women. The man responsible was Anthony Sowell, a predator who lived quietly among neighbors while turning his home into a nightmare. Sowell's early life was marked by violence. Born in 1959, he grew up under the rule of an abusive mother who beat the children with extension cords and subjected them to humiliating punishments. That cruelty bred cruelty. By the time he was a young man, Sowell carried rage that would later consume his victims. In 1989, he committed a brutal assault, luring a woman into his home, binding her, and subjecting her to hours of torment. He was convicted and spent 15 years in prison. When he was released in 2005, he returned to Imperial Avenue. Instead of reforming, he began building his private killing ground. Neighbors soon noticed something strange: the smell. At first, they thought it was spoiled meat from a nearby sausage factory. Others assumed it was a sewage problem. The stench became so overpowering that people filed complaints, yet city officials dismissed it. In truth, what they smelled were the bodies of Sowell's victims hidden inside his home. His pattern was cruelly consistent. He targeted vulnerable women, often those struggling with addiction, poverty, or unstable housing. He invited them inside with offers of food, alcohol, or shelter. Once inside, he strangled them, sometimes with cords, sometimes with his bare hands. Their bodies were left in the basement, the crawl spaces, or buried in shallow graves in the yard. For years, families filed missing persons reports, but because the victims were marginalized, their disappearances did not receive urgent attention. That indifference gave Sowell the cover he needed to keep killing. The horror finally came to light in September 2009, when a woman named Latundra Billups reported that Sowell had lured her into his house, assaulted her, and tried to strangle her. She escaped and went straight to the police. With her testimony, investigators obtained a search warrant. On the 29th of October, they entered the home and walked into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Ohio's history. Room by room, the nightmare unfolded. In the basement, remains were found. In the backyard, shallow graves yielded more. Upstairs, bodies were hidden beneath blankets. Flies swarmed through the air. Walls and floors bore stains no amount of cleaning could hide. By the end of the search, the remains of 11 women were recovered. Some had been dead for years. The trial in 2011 brought families of the victims face to face with the man who had taken their loved ones. They held photographs, tears streaming, as prosecutors detailed the atrocities. Survivors who had narrowly escaped described his violence in harrowing testimony. The defense argued brain damage and long-term alcohol abuse, pleading for mercy. But the jury saw through it. Sowell was convicted on 82 charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and assault. He was sentenced to death. Yet death never came. In February 2021, before his execution date, Anthony Sowell died of a terminal illness behind bars. For many, the end was unsatisfying. He never faced the needle. He never fully answered for his crimes. The house itself became a symbol of horror. After the investigation, the city demolished it in 2011. Today, the lot is empty, covered with grass. But to those who live nearby, the memory lingers. They remember the years of complaints about the smell, the pleas from families of missing women, and the silence of a system that failed to listen. Anthony Sowell's story is not only about one man's brutality. It is about how society overlooked women whose lives were already fragile, dismissing their disappearances until it was far too late. His legacy is a chilling reminder that monsters thrive when victims are ignored, and that sometimes the most ordinary-looking houses conceal unimaginable nightmares. Brazil has long struggled with violence. But even in a country hardened by crime, one man's story stands out. His name was Pedro Rodrigues Filho, but the world would come to know him as Pedrinho Matador, Little Pedro the Killer. He was no ordinary murderer. By his own admission, he killed more than 70 people, perhaps over 100. But unlike others, Pedro insisted he was different. He claimed he only killed those who deserved it, abusers, criminals, and men he considered guilty. To some, he was a vigilante. To others, he was simply another monster who justified his bloodlust with excuses. Pedro's life began in violence before he even took his first breath. Born in 1954, his father was brutally abusive. While Pedro's mother was pregnant, his father kicked her in the stomach so hard that the child would carry permanent damage for the rest of his life. That brutality was Pedro's inheritance, and by his teenage years, the cycle of violence had already consumed him. At just 14 years old, he committed his first murder. When his father was accused of stealing food from a school kitchen, Pedro believed the real thief was a local official, the deputy mayor. To Pedro, that man had destroyed his father's reputation unjustly. So he stole a shotgun, waited outside City Hall, and shot the official dead in cold blood. Hours later, he tracked down the man he thought was the real culprit and killed him too. In a single day, Pedro's path was set. He became a killer, not for survival, but for what he saw as justice. By 18, he had already built a reputation. Moving to São Paulo, he briefly tasted something like normal life when he fell in love with a woman named Maria Olympia. For a moment, there was stability, a dream of family. But when Maria was murdered by rivals, Pedro's answer was predictable: revenge. He hunted down her killers one by one, executing them without hesitation. From then on, killing wasn't just something he did, it became his identity. In 1973, police finally arrested him. Yet prison didn't stop Pedro. If anything, it gave him more victims. Behind bars, he declared himself a vigilante judge of other inmates. He targeted rapists, gang members, and men he saw as predators. Some he stabbed dozens of times, others he strangled. He even carved words into one victim's body, boasting of his violence. For Pedro, prison wasn't punishment. It was a hunting ground. The most infamous act of his prison years was directed at his own father. While incarcerated, Pedro learned that his father had brutally murdered his mother with a machete. Pedro swore revenge. During a prison visit, he ambushed his father, stabbing him 22 times before cutting out a piece of his heart. He put it in his mouth, chewed, and spat it out. Even among killers, this act was so shocking it became legend in Brazil's prisons. By the time courts tallied up his crimes, Pedro Rodrigues Filho had been convicted of 71 murders, but investigators believe the number was far higher. His sentences added up to over 400 years in prison, yet Brazil's laws capped prison terms at 30 years. In 2007, after serving 34 years, Pedro walked free. Most killers fade into obscurity when released. Pedro did the opposite. He embraced his notoriety. He started a YouTube channel, telling stories of his past, commenting on current crimes, and even claiming he had reformed. His channel grew, attracting thousands of subscribers who were morbidly fascinated by a killer lecturing on morality. Some saw him as brutally honest. Others saw him as offensive, a man turning blood into entertainment. But Pedro could not escape the life he had chosen. In March 2023, outside his home in Mogi das Cruzes, São Paulo, gunmen ambushed him. He was shot multiple times in broad daylight and died instantly. The man who had taken so many lives was himself cut down by violence. His murder remains unsolved, perhaps revenge, perhaps organized crime silencing him. Pedro's story leaves behind haunting questions. Was he truly a vigilante, striking down the guilty? Or was that just his excuse, a way to paint bloodshed as justice? To the families of his victims, his reasoning didn't matter. Their sons, fathers, and brothers were dead, regardless of his justification. In the end, Pedro Rodrigues Filho lived and died by violence. His legacy is a warning. Brutality cannot cleanse brutality. Violence never cancels violence. It multiplies it, leaving behind nothing but more pain, more fear, and more blood. When we look back at these stories, Aileen Wuornos thumbing rides on Florida highways, Ted Bundy smiling his way into the lives of unsuspecting women, Jeffrey Dahmer hiding horrors inside an ordinary apartment, John Wayne Gacy burying bodies beneath the home where he played the role of clown, Richard Ramirez terrorizing entire cities with random nighttime attacks, Andrei Chikatilo stalking the broken countryside of the Soviet Union, Samuel Little drifting across America leaving dozens of women behind, Anthony Sowell turning his Cleveland home into a graveyard, and Pedro Rodrigues Filho turning violence into his own twisted sense of justice. We see not one kind of evil, but many faces of it. They were different in method, motive, and background, but they shared a chilling truth. Evil often hides in plain sight. Bundy was the charming law student. Gacy, the friendly neighbor. Dahmer, the quiet man living alone. Little, the drifter no one noticed. Wuornos, the outcast who claimed survival as her excuse. Sowell, just another resident in a neighborhood struggling with poverty. Chikatilo, a schoolteacher and clerk. And Pedro, who even after prison tried to reinvent himself as a storyteller. None of them looked like the monsters we imagine in nightmares. And that is why they terrified us most. They reminded us that anyone can wear a mask. The victims are the true center of these stories. They were sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, students, mothers and friends. Many of their names have been forgotten by history, overshadowed by the infamy of the killers. But every statistic was a stolen life, every headline, a broken family. Behind the numbers, 93 victims of Samuel Little, 33 of John Wayne Gacy, 17 of Jeffrey Dahmer, were people who laughed, dreamed, and trusted, only to be betrayed in the most violent way. Society often failed them. Many victims came from marginalized communities, poor, addicted, or stigmatized, and their disappearances were dismissed. Authorities ignored complaints, overlooked evidence, or refused to believe families. In some cases, like with Chikatilo, innocent men were punished while the true killer kept hunting. In others, like Sowell's neighborhood, residents begged for help while the smell of death lingered in the air, and no one listened. Their stories are not only about killers, they are also about systems that looked away until it was too late. Yet even in the darkest accounts, there is something for us to confront. Evil doesn't always scream. It often whispers. It hides behind smiles, good jobs, or masks of respectability. It thrives where society is indifferent, and it grows strongest when victims are unseen. These cases leave us with an unsettling reflection. Monsters are not born in caves or summoned from nightmares. They are human. They walk among us, wave from across the street, hold positions of trust, or smile at us in passing. That is why their stories haunt us, because they are not tales of ghosts or legends, but of people who chose cruelty again and again. And so, when we speak their names, Wuornos, Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy, Ramirez, Chikatilo, Little, Sowell, Rodrigues, we should not remember them as legends, but as warnings. Warnings that beneath the surface of ordinary life, darkness can fester. Warnings that every society must listen to the voiceless, protect the vulnerable, and never underestimate the evil hidden behind a familiar smile. In the end, these killers wanted to be remembered. They wanted fame, notoriety, and power over our memories. But the truth is, their legacy should not be their names, it should be the lives they took and the lesson they leave behind. Because the most terrifying monsters in history are not shadows in the night. They are human beings. And they remind us, with every crime, of what happens when humanity loses its way.